It's interesting what you were talking about in LA in terms of the past. And it seems as if you're in the present, it seems almost impossible to not have some residue of the past, interpreting and influencing and determining what is experienced. Without something having been opened to make that obvious.
Well, you don't need to not have influence of what you're interpreting as being the past in the present, but that is only a very small portion of what your present experience is. So experience of memory and associations and all those sorts of things is present, but it's a small portion of the field. And the vast portion of the field is spontaneously new. I mean, even that is spontaneously new, of course, but the vast portion of your experiential field is explicitly spontaneously new, with no reference to anything that seems to be historic or particularly time-related. So in other words, even if you have memory associations, that is a small portion of your experiential field.
Well, even the spontaneity of it seems as if it is influenced by previous patterns of taking for granted what is happening now, that with a kind of a drag on it, so that it's not vibrant and fresh and new.
It depends upon your focus of awareness. If you're focused on, if you're heavily biased towards focusing on mental interpretations or historical interpretations or any of that kind of thing, then that can seem to loom large in your experience. But you don't need to be.
I was thinking more of an unconscious level.
Well, it is, of course, it's typically very unconscious. And that's what this is all about. This is what noticing is all about, is to discover that you can and do have immediate access to spontaneity, to freshness. And once you do so, that will begin to loom larger and larger in your experience, and you'll be less and less inclined to be constantly gravitating towards these mental interpretations as being the lens through which you view your experience. Because it never actually is. You have to create, it takes a lot of force to create and set up that kind of an orientation.
Seems as if there's a subliminal kind of security in bringing up what is known.
It may seem that way, but it's the opposite. The ignorant mind clings to ignorance with the idea that there's an advantage in doing so. And of course there's wholly no advantage whatsoever in doing so. But of course that's why it's ignorant, because the mind doesn't understand that. The whole issue is the clinging to ignorance. Reality is completely available. The problem is not getting to reality. The problem is letting go of clinging to ignorance, clinging to heavy-handed, erroneous interpretations. And of course it feels like there's all sorts of motivation, fear-based motivations, all kinds of motivations of, I have to orient myself to this. It's really important that I do so. And typically it's more like a nameless dread or just a sense of vague, sort of boogeyman-ish urgency that motivates this sort of, there's an unspoken, undefined, horrible outcome if you don't. but it doesn't stand up to analysis. And most directly, if you let yourself have a little direct experience, it's fun, it's interesting, it's nourishing, it's stimulating, it's informative, it's intelligent. I mean, it's a win-win-win to go to actuality, and then going back to your heavy-handed mental interpretations is just like going, back into a dirty, horrible, tiny little cramped room with nothing to do in it. It's like, what's the point? And yeah, you can go hang out there if you want, but why?
You make it sound really appealing.
But you have to have direct experience of actuality. But that's doable because you are and do have a direct experience of reality. And especially if you get to a point where you're seriously engaged in this level of inquiry, then certainly that is relevant. If you're trying to sell this to someone that's just completely entrenched in delusion, then that is a bit of a challenge. The issue is never, the difficulty of leaving our, interpretive way of relating to our experience, or the seductive nature of being with it in that mode. The issue is that there is no contest. It's not. If you can't see the point in leaving that behind, then don't. You're welcome to hang out there. And most people do, numerically. So that's viable. But there is an alternative, and it's a workable alternative, and it turns out to be rather an alternative with some rather nice perks to it.
Kind of like pig pen. Dragging around like all these flies around your head.
Sure.
Everywhere you go. Not even aware of it, just.
Sure. But we create our own darkness and smallness and being cut off from nourishment and cut off from fulfillment and liberation and transcendence. We do that. It's not something that's being done to us that we need to, fight even. We're actually doing it. You just need to stop doing it and it goes away. Ignorance is actively created in real time. It has no momentum. You have to actually reboot it in real time continually for it to even be there.
It feels as if there is a natural balance that happens, that when there is the experience of an opening and all of that kind of disappears, it's like then it comes back with a vengeance to kind of balance out that opening. And it's like, oh, don't try that.
Well, it can seem like that at certain phases of the process.
Well, I've talked to other people too, and I've noticed this along, and it's interesting when other people talk about that same effect of that happening.
Yeah.
It's as if there's some sort of natural balancing.
It's not balancing. It's your smallness fighting for its life, trying to claim you. It's the devil trying to take your soul.
Peter, can we just go back for a moment to that continuously rebooting ignorance?
Yeah.
That makes it sound like there's an effort involved.
Yeah, there's an enormous effort involved.
I don't know.
Put it this way.
It's not natural.
Clear reality is completely effortless. When you drop all effort, when you let go of everything, what remains is clear reality. It's very, very easy to get to reality. Just let go of everything. Just drop everything. Everything. Just drop it right now. Bang. Just drop it. Where are you? You can't say. Huh? What could be easier? Just drop everything. And the opposite of that is clearly not dropping everything, i.e. holding something up, i.e. being effortful, having attention. Okay?
But that tension is something that people have learned to live with.
Oh, absolutely.
And accept as natural.
Oh, absolutely. It's
And so
unconscious.
that it is, although it is effort,
It's not identified as
it's
effort.
not identified as effort.
It's not known as effort. It's identified as normalcy.
Well, it's only identified as effort once you get the flip side of that, which is not doing that.
Yeah, sure.
The contrast.
Yeah,
When the energy is freed up and you feel
yeah,
a
sure.
sense of relief, then you can look from that point of view at the other experience and see that it is
Sure, yeah.
effort laden.
Yeah. Yeah, it's as simple as holding tension or releasing tension. And if you don't hold tension, it will release. You have to be deliberately holding it on some level. Typically unconsciously, but nonetheless, it is a specific real-time maintenance that has to be fed and held and maintained. And if you don't do that, it just bottom drops out. And then it's gone instantly, instantaneously. There's none of it. Doesn't need to be dismantled or carted away or, thrown on the junk heap somewhere. It's just gone. Like the bubble popped. It's the old rope and the snake. The snake doesn't need to be killed and carted away and his body disposed of. Because there is no snake. It's just in that one moment of recognition, the snake is gone forever, and it was seen that it was never there. And if you find yourself getting seduced back again and again into interpretive ways of being with your experience, just go back to the evidence. Look at experience itself and see what it actually is. And you will see that it does not accord with what your interpretations are. It simply doesn't. There's no experiential support for erroneous interpretations. There just isn't. You can only maintain ignorance if you're not looking at what your experience actually is. So if you go to the evidence, all that is instantaneously disproved. Maybe not instantaneously, but specifically disproved. Because you discover instantaneity. You discover, absolute dynamism. You discover absolute disappearance of all specific circumstances in real time. You discover indefinability. And in the face of all those objective conditions that actually are findable and nothing else is findable, it's impossible to maintain the opposite unless you just are a crazy person. You say, oh, evidence be damned. It just is like that. I can't find any permanence, but it's permanent, damn it. It's, okay, cool. Well, if you're going to, on that basis, the sky's the limit, And you're Napoleon. Good luck on the Eastern Front.
It is instantaneous.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Noticing is instantaneous. And falling into delusion is instantaneous. But delusion can't win because there's nothing to support it. There's no evidence.
No, it does.
But it can't win ultimately. Because there'll always be a disjunction between your deluded version of things and the evidence of your experience that will always be frustrating as hell. Because things don't work out the way in accordance with your interpretation. And so there's obviously nothing wrong with my interpretation, so there must be something wrong with events. Yeah, right. That works.
Riding a bicycle seems to be apropos. I mean, before you learn to ride a bicycle, it's impossible to
Completely
imagine
impossible.
how it works.
Yeah. And then you ask people, how do you ride a bicycle? They try and tell you, and you go, what? That sounds like gibberish. What are you talking about? But then you just do it, and then you get it, and then
You've always got it.
yeah, and then it's like riding a bicycle. Yeah. I mean, even if you've seen this once, even if you go into delusion, you can go right back to it instantly, because it's always right here. And then after a while, you just realize, you just get to the point of, why keep leaving it and coming back to it? Why don't I just hang out in it? It's so much nicer. I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's just...
I read this book of Adyashantis about people who get it and then forget it.
Huh.
And I could never... It's not forgettable. At least it doesn't seem to be forgettable.
Well, I mean, in my experience, it's very common, in terms of what I have arbitrarily called integration, that this sort of moving back and forth between relative clarity and relative confusion is very common as people move into this. And I would say it's very rare, if almost unheard of, for people to just sort of, for the balloon to pop and stay popped. And I think this is a natural way of the way this establishes itself. It's because I think it's very thorough. It disproves, it dismantles your tendency to go to ignorance by allowing you to go back and forth again and again and again and again, so you get really clearly what's going on with it. It's like rubbing a dog's nose in his poop. It's like the tough love approach. It's like, okay, you don't get it, here, have some ignorance, and then come back and then lose it, and then, oh, okay, here, try it again. Until eventually it just does. You just say no. I don't need that. I don't need to go there. There's nothing there for me. It's all bullshit. It's insanity. I don't need to go there. I am made of sanity. So why should I go hang out in insanity? There's no basis for it. And then you stop bouncing back and forth. But you don't do that until you get sort of the strength and clarity to be able to really own that position. And until then, you typically you sort of bounce back and forth. But most people seem to some extent or another. Typically a lot, and typically for a good period of time.
But when you bounce, you still have that knowledge.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's more of a a kind of a double, it's almost like a split personality thing in my experience, you know, where there's the knowledge and the certainty of that, of actuality, and then there's my usual bullshit and God, what's up with that? How does that work? But the knowledge of reality isn't gone.
No.
But there can be.
The bullshit
I mean, for
doesn't
me,
bother you.
yeah, for me, I mean, there was 24 years of this kind of thing, so I'm intimately familiar with this phenomenon. You know, and during that period of time, I was kind of schizophrenic. I mean, I don't know, not schizophrenic in a formal psychological sense, which I have no idea what that actually means, but in the sense of sort of living my life on two levels simultaneously. On one level was the certainty of this astounding experience that had come to me, and on the other level was the normalcy of my pathetic life and my personality and my shoddy relationships and my failed aspirations and so on and so forth. You know, the dreary details of human life, and those sort of two levels were going on, and I just couldn't make sense of them or see the way in which they were one, or see. You know, it was just sort of oil and butter. Until I did see, and I saw that, oh no, it's not like that. But I couldn't see it until I could see it.
I mean, it's almost like another layer of maturity, maturation.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, like there's the initial maturation, and there's another sort of trying out things from a new perspective.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, it's hard, you know, you can't really make sense of it, but it does seem to work in that way. You know, yeah, it's coming to a really solid maturity that has proved itself. It has proved itself by being dragged down into delusion until eventually you are Teflon, and it can't happen. But you keep getting dragged down until you are Teflon. And the process of becoming Teflon can look a lot like being dragged down continually into the bullshit. See, evidently, I mean, this is all spin doctoring. God knows what's really going on, but it certainly looks as if it's something along those lines. But the point is, in practical terms, the point is, you can always go to noticing, and I recommend you do so whenever it's easy. Period. And in the long run, one day, that's where you'll be all the time. Even if you seem to not be all the time at present or at any particular time.
There's also a really, I was going to say difficult, but it's not really difficult, it's complex idea of grokking experience. Just to really understand what experience is and how it affects this, how it is this. I mean, not affects this. What are you driving at, John?
Yeah, that's what they were talking about in LA. I thought that was interesting.
What was that?
That you're actually asking, well, what is experience?
Yeah.
And it's all one thing, and experience is the same as is the one thing.
Yeah.
Well, it's your experience. I mean, it's
Well,
experience.
when I ask what is experience, what I'm inviting you to do is discover radiance. Experience is radiance and nothing but radiance. Experience is, when I ask what is experience, I mean what is the substance of experience? What is it that is present? Okay, here's experience. It's present. What is it that is present that we're calling experience? And we're used to deconstructing that. Oh, vision is present, and sound is present, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. What's the common denominator of all that? What is it that is present as experience across the board? And you will find that it is something. It's not nothing. It's a very subtle something. It's a very multidimensional something, but it's definitely a something. Experience has a substance. Experience is an actuality. It's an objective, present actuality. And this actuality is perceptible. And this, the substance of experience itself, is what I call radiance. And when you find that, then you stop being confused by all of its aspects of diversification, because it's inconceivably diversified in terms of its presentations. But it's always one thing.
How about the term aliveness?
How about it?
What's missing there?
Nothing.
That seems to
Aliveness is good.
resonate as experience, like a
Sure.
basis of experience.
Sure. Yeah, but it's not a term, it's an actuality.
Right.
And the point is to go to the actuality rather than go to symbols of it or ideas of it.
Well,
But absolutely.
communicate
Yeah.
what's felt.
Yeah, it is aliveness in the sense that aliveness is a good term because it communicates the dynamism of it, and also the purposefulness of it, and also the intelligence of it. There's all sorts of terms that are appropriate: aliveness, presence, radiance. I mean, all these kinds of words are evocative, but they're not the thing itself, and the thing itself is right here. And the point is to notice it. Notice this, the actual substance of experience. Notice, answer the question, what is experience, by identifying what experience is as a present reality and of course making up your experience.
When you say notice this, are you actually saying be this? I mean, just
Sure.
do it or be it, just do it.
Well,
Let it just happen. I mean, just...
Well, it's always happening, but identify what it is that is happening. It can see itself. It can know itself. And it's very used to knowing itself partially, right? So it's easy to notice light. It's easy to notice the color of this mug. It's easy to notice the sound of my voice. It's easy to notice that. But notice the whole thing all at once. What is it that you're noticing? It includes all of that, that is all of that all of that is made of and consists of. There's the one thing that is all of this diversification. It's like finding the dream, in terms of the analogy of dreaming. I mean, if you were dreaming right now, you could be seeing things and hearing things and doing things and touching things and all that, but there's nothing actually present but a dream. So how do you find the dream in the midst of all of this stuff? Well, the dream is all the stuff. All the stuff that's present is made of the dream and nothing else. There's no other substance present when you're dreaming but dream itself, and that is the substance that makes up everything that seems to appear within the dream. Likewise, there's no substance present right here, right now, other than whatever it is, what I call radiance, or call it aliveness, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. The thing itself is important. So there's this one substance right here, right now. What is it? Look and see. It can see itself. So just look and see what it is. You won't get an answer. It doesn't collapse or coalesce into a definition or something you can say. But you can know it most intimately. You do know it most intimately. It's just a matter of noticing that you do. What's the feel of experience? What is the feel of experiencing? It has a very specific texture. It's subtle and difficult because it's omnipresent. It's like trying to smell oxygen. Well, we're always smelling oxygen, so we don't notice it because there's no contrast. If the oxygen was all of a sudden gone and then came back, you go, and when it came back, you go, oh, great, oxygen, among gasping for breath and everything else. But experience is the same way. Experience is always present, so we are sort of, it's neutral. It's plain vanilla. It's zero. It's the 0 point. So there's no contrast to it to notice it. But when you get that it's something, it's not just the contents of experience that are something, but experience itself is a something. And it's a something that all the contents are actually made of, actually consist of.
What about that point in the morning when you wake up and then all of a sudden something clicks?
Sure, that's great.
Is that what you're referring to? I mean, is
Well, that. Of course, that's it. But I mean, that's it as much as anything is. But that is, I mean, in these in between points, it's arguably more identifiable because the content hasn't set in yet so heavily-handedly. You haven't gone to the circumstances. There's just it's like when you first wake up and your eyes are just open. Before there's anything, before you know what day it is or what you have to do or who you are or where you are, there's just this presence, and it is something that is present. Experience is present. I mean, call it experience, call it radiance, call it what you like, but it's something, and it has quality, it has flavor, it has nuance, it has texture. Experience has a texture. The Tibetans say that the best time to see it is right after you die. So I recommend that right after you die, you pay attention.
Well,
But when you wake up in the morning, it's also good. Or sitting right here, right now, is also good.
Right after you're born is another good time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that's another really good time.
Probably just before as well.
yeah. But that moment, just when you wake up before you really feel alive, that almost seems toned down. I mean, the other just seems to come on with gangbusters.
Which other of which?
Well, when you wake up before the juice just sets in.
Here, want to see something? Want to see something? Yeah, look at this. Ah! Did you see it? Ah! Did you see it? That's waking up right there. When you hear that, it's like all of a sudden there's that moment of startliness, and then there's a moment where it's nothing, and then it takes a minute for your world to settle in again.
That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, sure.
You don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, you don't know what's going on. There is no what's going on. It's just this, the radiance.
How do you know it's even this? I mean, it's like you don't...
Because there's nothing else.
What's interesting, because it goes back to the whole devil thing, that sometimes actually the thing that seems to be, organized and calculable is actually a great doorway into this. Because it's like you already know that, and then there's so much more going on.
Well, I'm not sure I followed that, but...
Well, I think just, lately I've been seeing that the sense of dislodgement that happens when things don't quite go the way that I want them to.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing that as disruption or disturbance, that in fact it's a great doorway.
Yeah.
Maybe that's better.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is why...
But if I can catch that and turn in that direction,
yeah,
with
it's
awareness,
opportunity.
that it's just rather than anxiety and suffering and fear. And
this is why delusion ultimately self-destructs, because it always gets to a point where it's not working.
Yeah.
It always gets to a point where your version of things is just woefully inadequate, and it's not doing anything for you. And at that point, the disjunction between actuality and your version of things, there's an inherent destabilization there that is a great opportunity. And typically we just redouble our efforts and come up with more bullshit, patch the cracks in our pre-existing bullshit with new bullshit. But sooner or later that cycle repeats, and you get to a point where
Now those cracks. seem like just temporary things. Those are just like spontaneous.
They're spontaneous. That's their power. It's their spontaneity. That's why they're an opportunity. They're cracks in the edifice of your delusion, and they are made of spontaneity. They're made of actuality, intruding rudely. And things like major disease or catastrophes, or even major, like winning the lottery or something, is equally disruptive. Although perhaps at first it seems not so. So I recommend you go out and win the lottery.
I recommend you go out and buy a ticket.
No, I don't recommend you buy a ticket. I just recommend you win the lottery.
Well, you had been talking before about not going back to delusion, but when there's a crack, that crack doesn't stay open. I mean,
Right.
That's just a momentary thing.
Yeah.
And then what? I mean, then
Jump through it.
to
Oh my God, what happens when you jump off the raft? Where are you? Only one way to find out. Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? Where are you right after I yell? You don't know, do you?
no.
Yeah. Well, not knowing is a good thing. Not knowing is where you are. Where are you right now? You don't really know. Your bullshit says it claims it knows, but you don't know. And so that unknowing is reality. That unknowing is experience. That unknowing is the radiance. And, what claims that it knows anything, what claims that it's oriented, is your delusion. It's your fabrication. It claims it knows what anything is. It claims it knows what you are. It claims it knows what's happening. It claims it knows all this stuff, and it's pulling it out of its ass. It's making it up. It's all empty claims. It's all hot air. It's bullshit. It's just not true. The fact is, you don't know where you are. You don't know what you are. You don't know what's happening. You don't know how it's happening. I mean, it's just self-evidently. I mean, this is just simply true. And in that truth, what is it? Obviously, you can't say in those kinds of terms, but in its own terms, what is it? Well, it's presence. It's radiant. It's alive. It's undefined, and yet it's not nothing. It has astounding qualities that are unfindable, and totally transient, and totally unstable. And that's very interesting. It's an interesting place to be. And that's where you always are. That's what you always are. And noticing that is noticing the radiance, is noticing experience itself, which is not anything at all except itself.
Would you say that one moment is exactly like the next?
Yeah. Yes. Well, yes and no. It never departs from itself. It's always exactly itself, but it always presents with infinite uniqueness and infinite spontaneity. But what it is always itself. It never departs from itself. It never becomes something else.
So, waking up from sleep to being awake, or from before the shout to after the shout,
It's the same event.
nothing changes.
Nothing changes at all. I mean, that's the point, is to notice that what seems to change is just versions that it endlessly spins off in itself, but that don't actually depart from itself. It's constantly spinning off all these versions, and when you ride the versions, you generate bullshit. When you ride the versions are like hypotheses. Oh, maybe this is a world with space and time, and maybe I'm in a body, and maybe there's other people here. Right? That just pops up in real time, and typically we latch onto that and we ride it. But it's unstable because it's like a spark flying out from a sparkler. And so it peters out, disappears. But fortunately, there's a bazillion other sparks coming up to replace it that are not too dissimilar. And we're just like surfing these sparks, thinking we're somewhere, when we're just in this nowhere, that whose nature is to spin off these sparks that don't actually ever leave it or depart from it, even though they claim to. It endlessly spins off versions of itself, but the versions of itself don't go anywhere, and they aren't actually made of anything. They're just hypotheses. There's what if? What if? What if there was space and time? What if there was consciousness? What if there was memory?
Which also brings up, what if there was radios?
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah.
You're talking about something pretty subtle, aren't you?
Well, it's very subtle, but it's also very obvious. It's the subtlest of the subtle, and it's also the most obvious of the obvious. So, yeah, it's subtle, for sure. But all obviousness is nothing other than it, as well. So all superficiality is it. Yeah, it's subtle. Sure, it's subtle. Try.
No, in its neutrality, or without any of the features, or
Yeah.
you can. Seems like it's so subtle you can't really pinpoint it. Or
You can't pinpoint it,
can't.
but it's not pinpointable.
No.
But not pinpointing it is seeing it.
Yeah.
Not knowing it is knowing it, because it is not knowable. But you can know that, and in knowing it, in knowing that, you are knowing it very directly, even though you can't know it. But you can know that directly. You can't find it, but not finding it is finding it. You can know for a fact that you can't find it. It's not like not being able to find the ability to not being able to find it. That's a very different thing. But you find it, and then it's too weird. It's too weird to get a hold of. But you found it. When you find something that's too weird to find, then you found it, and it's like, yep, check that one off. I found it. You get a bumper sticker. I found it. Yeah, but yeah, it's like that. It's like that. It's the way it is. The way it is, which happens to be unfindable. It happens to be absolutely nothing. But it's not a nothing that is non-existent. It's a nothing that is everything. But all of this is just koans and riddles and all that. But it is itself. It is not the riddles about it. This is itself. I mean, the other thing you can do yourself, and if you don't want to freak people out, you can go into a bathroom or go someplace alone, away from people, and just sit quietly, and all of a sudden, really suddenly, just yell as loud as you can, real short, and it'll work. It'll work for you if you do it just as well as if someone else does it, and just literally try that. I mean, this is an old and highly recommended Dzogchen practice. You just yell. The traditional syllable yell is peit, but you can yell anything as long as it's very staccato and very loud. Just make it as loud as you can, and as short as you can, and just watch the arc of it. Watch the arc of what your experience is like, as you sort of the startlement. Watch the startlement, and then your world settles back in. It's like a flock of birds that, when a gunshot goes off, they all go up, but then they settle back down. Although it's much faster than that. And then do it again. And do it again. And just watch it. And watch where you are and what happens right after that shout. In that moment. It's just this moment which is...
The actual startlement.
Yeah. You can't say what it is. All of a sudden you don't know what you are, you don't know what it is, and yet It's very much something. It's very much itself.
Tell me before you do it.
Well, you can also trick God and do it to him too. With someone else, it's best if you don't warn them. Although don't do it if they have a weak heart or nervous disposition. Although that can be fun too. Then they'll really see. They say right after death is the best. So then you really see it. That's even better than a shout.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting. It's the moment of astonishment
Yeah.
where
There's just total lack of definition.
It's just
You can't say what it is.
you know that you are witnessing something, but not quite. I mean, it's like everything
Yeah.
is
You can't say.
disappeared.
Yeah, everything disappears, but nothing disappears. What disappears is your reference, your frame of reference. There's no reference. You're in referenceless being or referenceless experience. And the reference is what delusion is made of. Any degree of referentiality is what ignorance is made of. Reality is actually non-referential. Reality does not refer to anything. Reality is itself. Just all of it at once, monolithically. Just bang, poof.
Right, so you're saying reality is that...
Reality is non-referential. Yes. And yet referentiality can appear within that non-referentiality, and that's what delusion is made of. And when we are in confusion, we are inhabiting a network, a subtle imaginary network of referentiality, where we can say this is this and that's that, and I'm here and that's there, and blah 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 blah. In other words, basically, when you can think or say anything about anything, that's referentiality. When you can't think or say anything about anything whatsoever, that's non-referential. And that's the actual condition. The actual condition is non-referential. And in that moment of startlement, you're totally outside of referentiality. It's just bang. It's just like a flashbulb goes off and just pop. In fact, here's another exercise you can do. You watch me do it. It's this quiet. It won't be shocking. So you sit quietly with your eyes closed for a minute until your eyes are really accustomed to that, and then you open them just as fast as you can, like a flashbulb going off, and then you close them down again, leave them closed, and open them like that. And then in that instant, see the full field that appears. And you'll notice that all the detail appears, but if you do it right, when you so settle into, so your normalcy is this eyes closed state. So you're really you're in that space, that just eyes closed is sort of, that's where you are, really established. And then all of a sudden there's this intrusion of this other thing.
Actually, the same thing exactly happens when you blink, but in reverse. But,
Yeah.
But we're so used to it that we don't
Yeah.
notice it.
Yeah, we don't notice it. The thing about blinking, the thing about this is that typically what you see when you open your eyes is brighter than when you close, so it intrudes, and it's obvious. When we blink, it's actually a removal, so it's less obvious because it doesn't intrude, it doesn't pop so much.
But if you were watching a movie and suddenly went blank for a second,
Yeah,
you would notice it,
yeah,
probably.
yeah. Depending on how long, it's an interesting thing. But yeah, for sure. But all these kinds of things, and what you can do is, if you do that for like 10 minutes, so you're really acclimatized to having your eyes closed, and then maybe every 30 seconds you do the little opening thing. So for 10 minutes, and then open your eyes and keep them open, and see the way in which what you're seeing when your eyes are open is exactly the same as what you're seeing when your eyes closed, only looking different. And you can learn a lot about this.
It's the same.
Yeah. Sure. It's the same condition. It looks different, but it's the same condition. And and the way in which it is the same, you get experientially. Anyway, it's just some stuff to play with.
So logically, it also is a way of pointing to everything that we have reference to. I mean, if we make reference, then that reference is in relation to something that's non-referential.
Yes.
In other words, it would have to be there.
Yes. Yeah. There is no actual reference other than non-referentiality, because that's the only actuality there is to refer to.
Yeah.
So even referentiality is non-referential. It bootstraps itself out of nothing. But because it's complex enough, it doesn't notice that. It's like the dictionary. The dictionary is ringing around the rosy. You define a word in terms of 10 other words, and you define each of those words in terms of 10 other words. And you go around the circles long enough, you realize that the words, at no point do the words actually tie into reality. They're just words defined in terms of other words. But it's so complex and there's so many words, it seems as if it's substantial because you're dazzled with bullshit. I mean, it's like politicians. It's like listening to a political speech or something. It seems as if it's about something because there's just such a barrage of verbiage. There's just such a barrage of information. But it doesn't actually tie into, it's not actually about anything. It doesn't tie into reality at any point. And our cycle of referentiality is the same way. It's like, well, I'm in my body, and my body is in space, and space is in time, and there's other bodies in space, and there's history, and there's the past, and there's the future. So there's all these sort of points that are being held in imagination, but it doesn't tie into this present moment at any point, actually. Precisely. The assumption is it does, because there's sort of a juxtaposition. This actuality is present as the mind is doing this whole ring around the rosy imaginary game. So the assumption is that this is about this, but it isn't. It actually doesn't tie in at any point. You're talking about space and time, but they don't actually tie into this. This sort of the assumption that they do, because this is here while I'm thinking about space and time. So this is here, demonstrably, obviously, and there's space and there's time. So here's space and here's time, and this is here. So, so it sort of seems like it's about this, but then you go looking at this, and at no point does it actually declare space and time. It doesn't even imply space and time. The imagination imposes that, and then doesn't, is too dizzy to notice the fact that it's just this, they don't meet. There's no point where it's actual contact. Or consistency. You think, it's easy to think of objects. This cup really exists, and it's stable, and it's basically here, and it's basically not changing. I mean, sure, its molecules are vibrating a bit or whatever, but basically it's just sitting here inertly, pretty much the same as it was 5 minutes ago or a week ago, and pretty much the same as it's going to be 5 minutes or a week from now. So that's the fantasy, that's the imagination. And then you have the actuality of this. And the fantasy and this have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
He says, taking a slide on. That which is not here.
And if you don't think so, let out a yell, and then see what it is.
So does this non-referentialness become more known
No, it's never more known. It's always just exactly as, it's always unknown. That's its very nature. But it's sitting here. Your referentiality becomes less known, is what happens, because you stop asserting it and thinking you inhabit it.
Okay.
But this never becomes more known because it's not really, because its very nature is fuzzy, is tenuous. You can't ever find it, but of course it never goes away, so that's not an issue. But you come to know that very directly, and you come to realize you are that, whatever.
You know that that's what you are.
That's the only thing. That's the only condition that obtains. That is the natural state, the natural
So it
condition.
could be.
Well, it's the only thing that is. So of course you are it.
It's the only thing that could be real.
Well, it's the only thing that is
It
real.
is real. It is real because it's the only thing that could be.
Well, whether or not it could or couldn't, it is.
And the only thing you know is that it is real.
Yeah. And in the face of that, you let go of, and all of these versions and provisional, interpretive, and relational modes of frames of reference of interpretation just become more and more ghostly, and you relate to them less and less solidly, and you don't give them any seriousness. They don't necessarily go away. I mean, your mind and imagination can effortlessly generate these things, and it's not an issue because you're no longer setting up housekeeping in them. You're no longer a partisan of them, where you're advocating them and selling them and declaring that everyone who doesn't inhabit your particular fantasy is crazy and wrong. And you no longer inhabit that fantasy, even if that fantasy is more or less present and available for you to play with if you're interested. And it's really a matter of getting real. You notice the fact that you don't really know what anything is, and that becomes acknowledged as home, because it is home. Always has been home. It's where you actually are, which is where you are right after the yell. Right after the yell. That's home. Or right after you die. Or right after you wake up. Or for that matter, right after you go to sleep.
After you give me your lottery winnings.
Right.
Peter, when you yell, there is a moment of non-referential where there's nothing.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing. And then my experience is not so much a flock of birds, but it's like there's a big chasm that's opened up that can't be spoken of, but all around the edges something's clawing to pull it back.
Okay, sure.
That's what I get. He's clawing
Uh-huh.
to pull it back into referentiality.
Mm-hmm.
And just the logical problem that arises for me, and that is, I'd like to see the clawing as the same thing as the chasm, as the emptiness.
Yeah, well, it is.
I know that logically it is, or I mean, even authoritatively it is. The scriptures say it is.
Yeah.
But I don't see that. I mean, there's
Right.
a definite dichotomy between this.
Right.
They seem to be just antithetical
Yeah.
to each other.
Well, the more familiar you become with the chasm, the more clear it'll become the way in which they're the same. Because when we're more familiar with referentiality than referencelessness, there seems to be a big dichotomy there. Because typically we're even though we're immersed in it, we're unconscious of referencelessness. Because our consciousness identifies itself with reference. I mean, this is what people call the conscious mind. And coming to relate to referencelessness is basically coming to relate to your own unconscious mind. You know, in realization, the division, the wall between conscious mind and unconscious mind dissolves. So at that point, you are conscious mind, you are unconscious mind, and it's all present, it's all actual, it's all your experience. And at that point, you see the continuity. You know, I mean, to put it in those terms. I mean, I would say that's my experience very exactly. I don't know technically conscious mind or unconscious. I'm just talking, in pop psychological terms or whatever. But typically, most humans identify themselves with the conscious mind and with conscious modes of thought, and find unconscious modes of thought alien or threatening or weird or whatever. And this yoga is all about opening to those modes which are typically held unconscious, and discovering that we inhabit them, we are them, and that in those terms, this whole thing makes a lot more sense. You begin to see what it actually is and how it actually works. Whereas from the point of view of the conscious mind, you can't actually see it, because referencelessness is excluded from that mode. When you're a chauvinist of the conscious mind, you can't handle, you can't deal with, you can't even acknowledge referencelessness. It's too weird.
Whereas the clawing.
Well, the clawing is, it's that chasm is the referencelessness.
Right.
And then the clawing is the conscious mind trying to reestablish control or reestablish dominance or whatever.
Yeah.
However, but at any rate, the relationship between the two is not really between the two, because they're really one. The conscious mind is a subset and a rather small mode of the unconscious. The unconscious is, it's like in the iceberg, the conscious mind is the small portion that's above water, and the unconscious is the vast portion that's below water. And when we inhabit the fullness of our being, we discover that most of what we are is the unconscious. Or what's held as unconscious vis-a-vis conscious and unconscious, i.e. the referenceless portion, the non-linear portion, it can't really be talked about, because talking is in the realm of the conscious mind. And so, of course, as soon as you start talking about it, the conscious mind assumes preeminence and claims to have dominance of the conversation, even if you're speaking from the reference, from the point of view of the unconscious. But experientially, you can come to experience that, and then basically, when you familiarize yourself with the unconscious, the artificial barrier, or the seeming barrier division between the conscious and unconscious, dissolves or is discovered to not exist. And then you see the true proportion of things. And you see the way in which they are one. Why don't we have a little break?
Experience that.
We'll be back shortly.
Yeah, that was the presentation.
What's hiding in plain view?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. And it's obscured by our distraction with all of this referentiality and defining that we're constantly doing. It's not actually obscured, but it seems to be obscured. And so what this does, what that yelling technique does, is it suspends that for a moment, and then you can notice what's here when that's not clamoring for your attention. And once you get familiar with noticing it, then you can notice that it is here even when you are doing the defining and stuff.
It's everywhere. I mean,
Yeah, of
it's
course.
constant all the time.
Of course, that's what this is.
Are we back on?
We're
We
on.
are. We need a little bell, crystal bell.
Oh, it's all good.
I'm not a sitter.
Repeat your question. What happens? What's happening when I remember that state of what?
Right,
I mean, the experience of it is one thing.
right.
There's no reference whatsoever. There's nothing you can say about that. But I can remember that. What does that memory? Is that memory the same in quality and content?
It is and it isn't. It is the same because basically experience is always that, and when you're remembering something, that's of course a real-time experience. So it is actually that, but it's also tainted with qualities that you attribute to recollection.
Such as?
Well, it can't be defined, but there's the subtle holdings of it being this or that. If you can remember it, then you're basically, reality is inconceivable, and so as such it's unrememberable, unsymbolizable, unrecollectable. So if you're remembering it, you're actually remembering a set of characteristics that you're attributing to being it, or to being close to it, or to being associated with it or something. And again, it's very subtle and slippery because the it is actually present when you're remembering it. So it is actually there, but you're also adding, you're complicating it to some degree with subtle qualifications, or else it wouldn't feel like a memory. If it feels like you're remembering, then that means that you're, if nothing else, you're at least adding characteristics that feel like memory. Otherwise, it would just be the state itself in real time, and it wouldn't be remembered. It would be like someone just yelled, which is not a memory.
Memory is an objectification of it.
Yeah, to some extent. And objectification basically means adding imaginary characteristics.
Subject object.
Whatever, I mean, however you define that.
Mm-hmm.
You're adding something, whether it is...
I know that I'm remembering.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, whatever. But there will be... There's some kind of value added that to some degree muddies the issue and diverges from the thing, even though the thing itself is, of course, always present in real time. So even while you're remembering, in this case, the state that you're remembering is actually present.
So here I am remembering it, that's objectifying it.
Yeah, to some extent.
How do I get to it through that?
You don't. Well, you can to the extent you become familiar with it, and then you can recognize it at any time. We were just talking about that. I think you may have been out of the room. You know, as you gain more familiarity with this referenceless condition, you will be able to notice it even when you're doing referentiality, because it is always present, obviously, as the condition within which apparent referentiality seems to be appearing. So it is always, so when you become more familiar to it, you can always recognize it even when you're being referential. In other words, you don't need to remove referentiality by a technique like the yelling in order to notice this referenceless condition. When you become more attuned to it, let's say more sensitive to it, more experienced with it, so you have the skill to recognize it. And you develop facility, that's all. You develop sensitivity to what it is, and then you notice that it never goes away, and once you notice it never goes away, then you're aware of its always being here. Whatever else seems to be here, to the extent that may seem to be the case. So referentiality always occurs in a context of non-referentiality. and non-referentiality always occurs in itself.
So how does the self fit in all of this?
It's just an assertion.
Yeah. And experience. And
Well, experience is this referenceless actuality and inactuality. But within that, all sorts of referentiality can arise, which can claim to be self, can claim to be experience or not, can claim to be this or that, can claim to be all of these essentially referential, i.e. defined notions. That this is then seen in terms of, or seen to consist of, or whatever. And then you have self, you have body, you have history, you have personality, you have whatever you want. Whatever you, whatever you want to essentially define into existence, you're free to do so within the context of this. But they're all just claims. They're all just assertions. So self is an assertion, just like body is an assertion. In actuality, there's no such thing.
yeah, when you say there's only one thing happening,
Uh-huh.
that's that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. I mean, the comment you made, Peter, about, the referentiality being able to coexist with non-referentiality, but the non-referentiality doesn't coexist in the other direction, but that non-referentiality is implied under all circumstances.
Yeah. Well, it's more than implied. It exists.
It exists.
It's the actual condition.
Right.
Referentiality is not actual. Referentiality is only actual because non-referentiality is actual. And then referentiality is actually non-referentiality masquerading as referentiality.
Right.
And since non-referentiality is actual, then referentiality can claim to be actual because it is non-referentiality.
It keeps pointing to something that's
Yeah. In other words, that sounds like a mouthful, but non-referentiality is the actual substance of what is present here, and nothing else whatsoever is present. So anything else that claims to be present is actually that, because that's the only substance that is here. So anything else that claims to be that has to be made of that, because there's nothing else for it to be made of. And so referentiality, which can claim to be here, is obviously made of non-referentiality, because non-referentiality is the only actual thing here. It's the only thing that anything could be made of, because there's nothing else actually present.
the ultimate conundrum.
Well, it is, in a way.
It's not actually a conundrum because it's...
What is
Right.
for referentiality?
It seems to be a conundrum. This is the conundrum. This is the spiritual conundrum. It turns out to not be a conundrum.
Conundrum at all,
It's
no.
not
And when you
a
discover that, that's realization. But it seems to be a
But
conundrum.
from referentiality's point of view,
Yes.
it's a conundrum.
Yes.
Can you see both at the same time?
Sure.
You can.
Of course. And typically, when you're, in ignorance, or, when you're accustomed to what you might call a samsaric way of relating to experience, referentiality dominates. And even though non-referentiality is actually present, it's not recognized. When you become sensitive to it and you can recognize it, then you recognize that it is always present, and you also recognize that it is the actual condition that everything actually is, because there is nothing else than it. So obviously anything that is present is it. And so in that context, referentiality can still seem to be present. But it's in that context, it's clear that referentiality, which seems to be present, is actually non-referentiality, is made of non-referentiality, and exists in non-referentiality. Because, as I said, non-referentiality is the only thing that's actually present. It's the only condition that actually exists. So anything else that claims to be existing just bootstraps itself up on that.
I mean, it's the perfect scenario for a sleight of hand, really. Isn't it?
Well, it is sleight of hand. I mean, it's like a dream. You know, in a dream, the only thing that actually exists is the dreaming. And yet, all sorts of objects can seem to exist. Objects and situations and circumstances can seem to exist. But they only can seem to exist because the dream actually does exist. And since the dreaming alone exists, then all these objects and circumstances obviously consist of nothing but the dreaming, and they're not actually independently existing. They're just interpretations of, ultimately, the dreaming itself, which alone is the actual thing, so to speak, or condition that is present. And likewise here, what we're calling non-referentiality is the actuality that is present alone. There is nothing else present. So anything else, seemingly else, that seems to be present must, by default, be it. Because it is what exists, so obviously anything that seems to exist must just be a version of it. And obviously referentiality can seem to exist, so referentiality, by default, must be it, because there's nothing else it could be. It can't be made of anything else, because what we're calling non-referentiality alone exists. I mean, the condition is much simpler than the description of it is.
That's what I'm thinking. It must be much simpler than the description.
Sure.
Because it must be just an immediate recognition.
Sure.
Just recognition.
Sure. Exactly so. I mean, you see that, you know, do the yelling experiment, and then you see that. It's just self-evident recognition. It requires no analysis. Quite the contrary. Analysis just jumps you into referentiality.
It's the worm or reverse.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. And that's what it's a symbol of.
Interesting, because I was reading a book about, antique furniture, and they were talking about borer holes, how to repair them.
Mm.
And they said that actually they're a sign, of great age.
Mm.
And
I was about to say, why repair them?
So you're better off to keep.
Well, duh. There are people that fake antiques that go to great lengths to simulate those borer holes. So why would you want to fix them?
My question comes out of the snake and the rope analogy, because ostensibly you can't see the snake and the rope at the same time. You might see the snake.
I think you can. I think you see the snake, you're not noticing that it's a rope. When you notice it's a rope, you can then retroactively see how you could have mistaken it for a snake, while still seeing that it is a rope.
Okay.
I mean, I would claim that. Obviously, there's no rope. It's a thought experiment. There's no rope or snake lying around here.
The snake doesn't care.
Yeah, doesn't exist. Of course, it doesn't care. I mean, that I would say is my experience. You know, when seeing non-referentiality, I can see the way in which, and I can see referentiality, and I can see the way in which referentiality could have claimed to exist independently, and I can see the way in which it doesn't.
You can do that in the desert when you think you're seeing water.
Sure, mirage.
And then you can go back and forth
Sure,
and see it.
sure. The thing about the snake and the rope, or in this case, actuality of non-referential condition and referential condition, is that the referential condition is the actuality. The non-referentiality is not actual. It's a much weaker, shallower, partial aspect of non-referentiality. It's not like they're equal. It's not like the snake and the rope. The snake is equal to the rope. The rope is actual. So the rope is much more comprehensive and powerful and full than the snake, which is a mere veneer, a mere ghost of interpretation. So it's important that with the rope and the snake, it's important to understand that they're not equal. The rope dominates by far in terms of its actuality, and the snake is a mere imputation. And so, in the similar condition exists with regards to these non-referentiality and so on. This actual condition is real, so it wins, it dominates. Referentiality and delusion and misinterpretation is ghostly, is a claim. It's spin doctrine. But this is the fact. This is not a spin doctrine. It's not like they have equal time or equal weight or equal validity.
You talked a little while ago about instantaneity.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say about that?
Well, it's hard to talk about. I mean, what do you think? What aspects of that are you interested in?
Well, I guess it feels like the referential world is not instantaneous.
Uh-huh.
It has a sense of being just off. It's like
Right.
a sense.
Yeah.
It's like a sense.
Sure. Well, instantaneity is self-evident when you examine the actuality of experience. Experience only exists in the instant. It's only actual in the instant and has essentially no duration or no findable duration. So all sorts of notions that involve duration, like time, history, past and future, all these kinds of things, transience of events, causality, all these kinds of things are on relatively shaky ground in the face of the self-evident and undeniable fact of instantaneity. So instantaneity is powerful to notice as a way of challenging those kinds of ways of being with experience. Not as necessarily heavy-handedly invalidating them, but at least putting them in a context of actuality. So you can discover that time exists with reference to the present moment, as opposed to being some actual panorama that actually exists. The present moment alone exists, and so if time exists, it is with reference to the present moment. so on and so forth. But anyway, but you can do the math yourself. But instantaneity is objectively and undeniably the case, and so that is the frame of reference of examining anything that seems to be more involved in that. I mean, it gives you a touchstone of orientation. Likewise, the fact of the absolute instability, or you could say non-duration of experience, the way that no condition that is experienced has any persistence whatsoever before it seems to morph subtly or grossly, which again is a touchstone of actuality that you can use to investigate notions of permanence and notions of duration and so on and so forth in terms of the existence of objects and so on.
So it seems as if any kind of effort or any kind of getting at this to have it be more dominant or
Hmm?
less, more so than what is costumed.
Right?
It's just a feeble attempt, thinking that you can't do anything.
No,
And
it's imaginary. It's a pretense.
it's just, you can't do it.
No, but you don't need to do it
Yeah,
because
no.
because this actual condition never goes away.
Yeah, there's no point.
No, there's no point. You don't need to do it. I mean, this actual condition is always here, so you don't need to get to it. You don't need to find it. It never goes away. Just you're free to notice it anytime you wish, and you're free to pretend you're not noticing it anytime you wish. But even when you're pretending you're not noticing it, you are noticing it because there's nothing else to notice.
Peter in Seattle asks, if one constantly experiences noticing, then how would one know one was noticing?
Well, it's not important to know you're noticing. The important thing with noticing is not to notice you're noticing. The important thing with noticing is to get out of your being with your experience in terms of interpretations, or being with your experience interpretively. The essence of noticing is being with your experience outside of interpretations, or outside of holding anything to be any particular way. Is a good way to put it. So just being with your experience without having any idea what anything is or what it is, as opposed to a normal human mode where usually unconsciously, we think we know what everything is. So that's a mode which you could say is non-noticing, but being in your experience where you rest in it, not thinking you know what anything is, you rest in it openly, you rest in it without a pretension of definition, and that's noticing. And as you do noticing, you discover what it is. You discover, again, that like we've been talking about this evening, you discover that it's actually the essential natural condition, and it's the background condition of all experience. Even if there seems to be something other than that going on in the foreground, that does not block or obscure the actual condition, and it actually consists of and exists within the actual condition. Mercury is retrograde, what can I say?
Again.
He says, thank you, that was very good.
Oh, well, good.
another question? You said some time ago that if there was an objective universe, this isn't it. But can we say that there definitely isn't an objective universe?
I said that if there is an objective universe, this isn't it?
Apparently.
Huh.
What to say.
Well, it depends what you mean by the word universe. This condition that is here is objectively real. It objectively exists to the extent that, depending on exactly what exist means. But exist means that this does exist in the way that it happens to exist, to the extent that's relevant. But it's certainly objectively the case. Let's put it that way. Whether or not it's a universe depends on what you mean by universe, and so that's just a matter of how you want to define that word. If by that word you mean, an actual system, then this is certainly a universe. So there is an objective universe in that case.
Which happens to include Mercury.
Maybe yes, maybe no. We can have a war over it.
Yes.
And if it does, it's probably in retrograde.
I was noticing the way that the conversation tonight seems to go into sort of circumlocutions. And I thought, oh, Mercury's in retrograde, okay. There you go.
Seems like every sense experience, every particle of experience could be like a putt to shot. It seems
Mm-hmm.
there's a numbing. I mean, I think of it as a numbing. Like you shout, and then that chasm, I experience that as a kind of numbing. I become numb.
Uh-huh.
I don't, it's just, it's a numbness, or you could call it void or whatever.
Whatever, sure.
But every sense experience has that first, doesn't it?
Sure, you could say that experience is constantly disorienting. Experience is intrinsically disorienting. You could say that for sure, yeah.
If I could go with the experience, I grab an experience and I hold on to it and try to analyze it, and then I go to the next one. But each encounter with each sensory experience is like that shout.
Yeah.
There's a moment of numbness, and then I claw and try to define that.
Yeah, absolutely,
Or
sure.
refer it to things.
Yeah.
Or if I look at the sun, all of a sudden, it numbs you for a moment.
Yeah.
Then you say, oh, it's the sun.
Sure.
Or you try to look at one sparkle. And if you can stay with it, I mean, if you can be that fast, because it's there for just...
Yeah. I mean, another way to put that is to be with direct experience, you will find yourself in non-referentiality. Because direct experience intrinsically is non-referential, which has the feeling tone of that kind of openness or chasm or numbness, what you're calling it. Referentiality has to be supplied to direct experience. So it's always essentially after the fact, or a reaction or something like that.
So the real experience is that numbness, and then what comes after it is a memory of, sort of like the memory of the shout.
Yeah, perhaps.
Or
Perhaps.
the memory of the numbness.
Yeah, perhaps.
Which I've interpreted as a thing, a
Yeah.
color, a form.
Right, sure. Interpretation is sort of after the fact. The fact itself, when you're in direct experience, you don't know what you're experiencing. You have to sort of figure out what you're experiencing as a reaction to experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what the sort of the opening your eyes thing does. You get that because when your eyes have been closed for a minute or two, and you open your eyes all of a sudden, there's a seeing, but there's no naming. You don't know. You can't say what you're seeing. It's too short. And there may be a subsequent period where the mind sort of grasps, plays catch up and tries to. Oh, I saw a person. I saw this. I saw that. But quite clearly, in just that flash of the presence of light, it's not anything in particular. It's just, it is, but it's not referred to anything. It's not defined. It's not. There's no designation. There's no context other than the flash itself.
So what I'm calling numbness is, isn't it possible to just stay in that numbness?
Well, it's possible to notice that you always are in that numbness because you're always in direct experience, and that the subsequent relationality, the subsequent defining and so on, doesn't actually take you out of that, even if it attempts to distract you from that. But it never actually stops direct experience. Direct experience is always happening, unceasingly. And direct experience is intrinsically non-referential. It's always surprising. In the instant, exactly what you experience is unpredictable and unexpected. Always. Even if you're sitting looking at the same thing, look at a wall, look at a still life, look at a glass on a table for 5 minutes, and every instant is startling and surprising. Because it's different. It morphs. You notice different things about it. It's a constant chain or an ongoing continuity of shock and surprise and unexpectedness and novelty and newness. So experience is always that and never stops being that. even if interpretation is occurring concurrently, or playing catch up or whatever, the interpretation doesn't actually block or stop direct experience, even if it seems to distract you from it, even if the attention seems to go towards interpretation. In actuality, real experience is never blocked off. That's why noticing is always possible, because you can always be with direct experience, because it never goes away. It's never not available and not accessible. And as soon as you're with direct experience, you notice its surprising nature, you notice its unexpected nature. At every instant, you didn't know you were going to be experiencing exactly that. So it's always like, wow, wow. It's just a continual stream of wow. And then the interpretive faculty can set in and try and create normalcy, or a layer of interpretation of defining it as, oh no, I'm just sitting in the room here with you all like I have been for an hour. But that's a layer of interpretation which is being imposed on or exists in the context of this constant ongoing actuality of startlement and surprise and wow, amazement that experience intrinsically is.